Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Restored to More podcast. We are so excited for our guest today, Jay Stringer. He is what I would say a friend to us, even though not in proximity, but he has really impacted our ministry and the people we're working with. And we are so excited for you guys to be blessed by his mindset and just everything that he is talking about in his new book, Desire.
Jay Stringer is a licensed mental health counselor, researcher, and author who has spent over 15 years helping people make sense of unwanted patterns and uncover the deeper longings beneath them. His work focuses on desire, sexuality, and relationships, guiding individuals and couples towards healing, connection, and meaningful change. Jay is the author of Unwanted, which has impacted hundreds of thousands of readers and is widely used by clinicians and communities. And his new book, Desire, that Charity just said, explores 5 core longings that shape our lives and relationships. Through his research, writing, and training programs, he equips leaders, therapists, and individuals to transform struggle into a pathway for growth and restoration. Jay, thank you so much for being with us today.
Charity Clinton, so good to be back with you. Thank you for having me back on your show.
Oh, well, we're just grateful you said yes. The episode we did with you last time about Unwanted was one of our it was mostly sought after. It was awesome. And we've used the work that you've done working with couples so often to help them kind of go, well, what is this coming from? Right. Let's have this curiosity into your struggle versus just wanting to get rid of it. So Jay, if you could just take a minute, like, how would you say that has impacted? You've written Unwanted. You've now been doing that work for a long time. We interviewed you, I think, when it was kind of still coming out. What have you seen? Like, what was the impact of that book? And even in clinicians and in practices, like, what impact has that made in a positive way?
Yeah, I think for a lot of us that have grown up in the church, the joke that I always make is learning about sex in the church or in faith-based circles is a little bit like going to culinary school, but the only thing that they teach you about is salmonella or food poisoning. So that sense of like, okay, I know what I'm not supposed to do, but then somehow the church, my marriage has the audacity to ask for a masterpiece out of me. And it's just such a setup for misery, for contempt, for anger at one another. And so I think part of what I started grappling with within Unwanted is thinking about like Desmond Tutu's famous quote, originally in the context of apartheid. But what he said is, there comes a point where we need to stop pulling people out of the river. We need to be able to go upstream to find out why people are falling in to begin with.
Yeah.
And so I think part of Unwanted was this initial sense of we need to go upstream to the key drivers of what is influencing people to pursue pornography, to pursue extramarital affairs. And so instead of just saying don't do it and get internet monitoring and try and manage your lust, I think that our lust actually has profound things to teach us if we're willing to pay attention to it. And so part of what I was trying to do in Desire or in Unwanted is just show that like our sin is not random. The problems of our life, the difficulties that we find ourselves in, they tell a story about where we come from. So just like a brief example that I think I put in Unwanted would be like the case of the Somali pirates. And so, I think it was like early 2010s, 2012, like the pirates were capturing our cultural attention, and that sense of like they're taking these big shipping vessels hostage. And just what do we do with international policy? But part of what we have to step into is, okay, there are warlords with a lot of guns ruling over inside the country. And then the United Nations estimates that we, as the Western world, was stealing something like $400 million of their fish off of their shores. And also, it was one of the cheapest places to dump toxic waste onto the shores. And so then it's like, okay, you have a lot of weapons, a lot of guns, very fast boats for fish that you can't fish anymore. What do you think is going to happen? So that sense of like, of course, fishermen are going to turn into pirates. And so I think that's part of the invitation for all of us to say, like, the things that we do wrong, the things that we are struggling with are not random. We need to look at the conditions of our geography, of our family of origin, of our faith of origin context. We need to look at not just how we sin, but also what are some of the unique ways that people have sinned against us? And that's really the conversation that we have to step into. So all that to say, unwanted sexual behavior is not random at all. We have the
Yeah.
research to show it. I think there's a lot of biblical theology to support that as well. So one of the things that I loved about Unwanted, and I don't know if I mentioned this before, but we will routinely get people from all over the world saying, "This is my sexual fantasy. Here's my porn search. Here's the fantasy that that enters into my mind right before I orgasm. Can Jay interpret this for me?" And so they'll offer like $20 over Venmo for me to interpret their
Yes.
fantasies. And it's both disturbing and funny, but also like I know it's striking a nerve that
Yeah.
people are not just trying to say like this is completely normal or just try and say that this is like so wrong and this is the horrible
Yeah.
thing and I need to just get rid of it. It's like people are getting curious about why they're doing what they're doing. And I think that's the point that,
Mm.
so much throughout the Old Testament is God, the angel of the Lord, showing up in really difficult places and just saying, like to Hagar, where do you come from? Where are you going? And so all of us need just more curiosity with regard to where we come from and where we're going.
Jay, we could stop the podcast right there. We're not going to, but that is
We're
enough.
done.
I mean,
Yeah.
that is so profound. And I just hope everyone hearing this just takes a minute to pause and go, wow, have I ever been curious about what's underneath these desires, these fantasies? In recovery for me, that was one of the key moments that really go, wait, I don't need to get angry at fantasy. I don't need to just try to suppress it, but I'd like to understand it. What's underneath it? What's going on? Am I pursuing something? Is there an emotion that I've never even really understood or professed before, or even like contemplated and wrestled through? And I think fantasy doesn't have to always be sexual. We're going to talk about that in this podcast, mainly being sexual, but there's fantasies all the time of, oh, a bigger house or a nicer car or a steady paycheck or all those things. And I think in my life, I've begun, I'm not great at it, but I've begun to go, wait, what's underneath that? What's underneath that beautiful
Yes.
pool I want in the backyard of our house? Is it just because I want a pool, or is it because I want status, or I want more community, or I want the ease of this? And I think there's something to be said about going deeper beneath every fantasy and going, man, what is underneath that, instead of just trying to suppress it. So I'm grateful for you in my life, Jay. You've really helped me understand my addiction, my behavior in so many different ways. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, so well said. It does. It comes down to the pool. It comes down to the symbols. And that's, I mean, we can talk about it later, but narcissism for a lot of men and women is not just like having a fullness of self or being full of yourself, as was often popular, at least when I was in high school. A narcissist was someone that was full of themselves. But clinically speaking, narcissism is not knowing who you are. It's
Mhm.
not knowing your identity, not liking who you are.
Um,
And so part of what you begin to fantasize about is to have these symbols that reflect back to you your worth. And so for some people that feel like crap or they felt like they were worthless, the symbol of a Mercedes that they get to drive is enough to drive so many of
Yeah.
their fantasies throughout life, or
Wow.
the partner that they have, the job that they have. So this is not just about unwanted sexual behaviors. This is really about what desires are, what's the seed, what's the formative stories that are informing any desire that we currently have. And I think we need a healthy interrogation for all forms of our desire.
mm.
So good.
So good. Well, let's get into this book because it's incredible. And we have so many questions on your book. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we're going to get to some. So, my first question, though, is you talk a lot about taking a middle road with desire, not dismissing it, but also not just indulging it. What does it look like to approach our desires with curiosity instead of shame or control?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, going back to just that, what Clinton had said with regard to the pool, like, why do you want the pool? Is it, a sense of, okay, this is a status symbol? Or, Ronald Rolheiser, who is a Catholic theologian, would say that the goal of desire is, he would say that all children are born with these raw desires. And the point of Christian community and parenting is to help connect that raw desire and form it intentionally to be able to serve and connect with the wider community. So, yeah, a pool might be something that you sacrifice a lot for to be able to kind of create something of a hub
Mm.
for a lot of kids to come and play, to be able to host people. And so, in that sense, it would have much more of a clean desire.
Mm.
But a lot of times, when it comes to other realms of desire, we either are quick to pathologize it because it feels selfish or, God forbid, sexual. And then we're also in a culture these days where a lot of us came from the suppression of desire. And then we became adults and we're like, I'm not going back to that.
Yeah.
And so then the creed became follow your heart. But there
Mm.
was no one actually teaching us how to form our hearts, how to actually form our desires. And so that was the bind that I kept having with, people would get really curious with unwanted, but then they would still go back to the same marriage. They would still
Mm.
go back to the same career. They would still go back to the same family of origin. And so then it just becomes like, what do I do with these desires?
Mm.
And so I think that was part of what I started grappling with is no one that I know of is really, really helping us to intentionally form our desires. And I think that's in the Latin, it's the via media, the middle path, where you resist uh, the way of pathologizing and suppressing desire, but you also dismiss the notion of like, if I just follow my heart, it's going to naturally take me to really good
Yeah.
places. It's like, come on. It'll
Yeah.
very naturally take you to greed, entitlement, rage. And so there are beautiful desires within us. And so that notion that desire has the capacity to make us into the most beautiful,
Mm.
best version of ourselves, but certain desires can actually form us into the worst version of ourselves as well.
Mm.
When you talk about this, Jay, my mind is racing with I mean, I was raised in the church. I was raised in conservative Baptist. And so it was like, oh man, like I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, oh, the heart is deceitful above all else. I'm like, it felt like suppression was the name of the game, right? That's what you got to do. You have to suppress yourself, only listen to Christian music because God forbid you hear a song from the 90s from MTV. Like, oh my gosh, your desires are going to
Yeah.
run rampant. And so there's that mode. We're 35, 34, and it's like we're right there on that cusp of like, oh yeah, those are bad. But then there's also this whole generation that's like, oh man, you're not a whole person until you've lived out those desires, right? You actually don't know who
Mm-hmm.
you are. Talking about identity, you can't even know your identity unless you pursue those desires and you experience them, and then you can decide for yourself whether they're wrong or right. But what you're talking about is so foreign, Jay.
Yeah.
Form your desires. I either know suppress them or live them out. But how does even one begin to go, well, wait a minute, how do I form my desires? Because they feel innate inside of me, either good or
Mm-hmm.
bad, but how do they form?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So fear desire, follow desire, and I think the third way is to intentionally form them. So one of the things that I've been grappling with quite a bit is, I would say that I'm not in a midlife crisis, but I would say I'm in like a midlife chrysalis. And I think the reason for that is one of the core concepts that I'm working through in my newest book is this notion of a provisional self. So, a provisional self is not your full identity, it's not your real identity, but it is the identity that you needed to form in order to survive your world, in order to navigate the unique context of your family of origin, your school, your faith tradition. And so when I think about my provisional self, I am a pastor's kid. So my older sister was much more the classic rebel. She was the one doing the things that would reflect poorly on my parents. My older brother was more the philosophical rebel. He was reading Nietzsche at 16, critiquing my dad's sermons and their way of being in the world. And so part of what I saw growing up was, my parents' marriage had their own breakdown. They had these two older siblings of mine that were creating a lot more conflict and enmity. And so part of what I realized is through being a golden child, through being good, that was both innate inside of me, but also became over indexed of, I'm not going to bring difficulty. I'm not going to bring truth to you. I'm just going to kind of be good and be something of a balm to you. that formed a lot of my desires. So I had a desire to meet my mom's emptiness and her needs. Uh, it, there were certain points in middle school where I remember I was bullied in middle school, didn't have a lot of language to talk about that. There's an area of our brain called Broca's area that goes offline when you're in trauma. So I have a very clear memory of being out to breakfast with my dad at a bagel bakery, and he was knew something was up, asked me how I was doing, and I had no words. I didn't know how to talk about that in my particular family of origin. And so part of what he said to me when he dropped me off at school that day was, he said, Jay, if you were an elder in our church, I would not continue to meet with you. And
Oh,
again, just devastating as a middle schooler to be bullied at school and then to have home be this place of, in some ways, theologically bullied, to
yeah.
reveal my heart, to talk about these things. So when I was in high school and college and I started reading dead theologians and, Lewis, Edwards,
Yeah.
Calvin, my dad and I had a lot to talk about. So the
Mhm.
more that I met my mom's needs through being a good therapist to her, kind to her, the more that I had theological things to say to my father, the more my life and their life went better. But
Yeah.
now I'm in my 40s and saying, wait a minute, like a lot of my desires throughout my life have been to navigate the idolatry of both my parents
Yeah.
and the difficulties. And so that becomes really like, what do I actually do to inform my desires, to form
Mm.
them? And I think that's the sense of, how do we form them? Well, I think it begins with our family of origin, of who did you need to become to survive that world? And all of us have grown up east of Eden. And so we
Yeah.
have beautiful, stunning aspects to our provisional identity. We also have places where we've needed to find soothing and comfort outside of relationship, outside of God, outside of being known, that are also wreaking havoc in our life. So when I look back, I see a boy that was really committed to being good, but
Mm.
wasn't always able to be honest. So that formation process is not just to be good again, not just to be the golden child, but to say, what has the master of the universe put inside of my heart? And am I free to honor what God has put inside of me? Or am I honoring the breakdown of the Stringer family system? And that's my identity. And so, part of what there's a guy by the name of I always forget his name, Martin Shaw. He wrote a book called Liturgies of the Wild. And one of the quotes that I have loved from him, I don't know if it's in that book, is he said, the soul is not above catastrophe to get your attention. And
Wow.
so for a lot of us, when we get married, it could be an unwanted sexual behavior, could be a career collapse, could be some type of what looks like a moral failure. But part of how I've been thinking about that is that that might be part of our soul and the spirit's way to get our attention, to be able to say, you've settled for an identity that's provisional. It's not
Well,
real. And you also have this realm of secrecy in your life that needs to be cracked open so that something healthy and new can emerge. And I know you all know this work from work that you do in your marriages as well. The crucible, the crisis actually becomes almost a rite of passage in our world to be able to form you into a healthy system. And I'm so angry at that. That why is it in the church and in so many families that crisis is needed for formation to take place? I think it will always be the case. But what if we didn't have to dramatically fail
Mm.
yeah.
in order to form our desires? So, long answer, but like, you've got to study where you come from.
Yeah.
You've got to kind of study your heart, what breaks it, what forms it, in order to actually know where to go in the future.
Okay,
So
this
good.
is yes, so
So
good.
good,
And
Jay.
so I have a question. We have some like not they're not engaged yet, but they're thinking of engagement and they come to us and they share like, oh,
They're seriously dating,
yes, seriously
right? Yeah.
dating, sure. And they want to get married with intentions of getting married. And he struggles with addiction to pornography and she finds out and she's heartbroken. vice versa. There's just a lot of brokenness there. And they come to us and they're like, help us, you know? And I guess my question to you is, how important is it for them to both share and really understand their story, their desires, and in their sexual narrative, kind of with their significant other, even though they're not married yet, but they want to get married? Like, would you say that
Yeah.
Would that benefit
would that
them?
benefit them as a seriously dating couple before they get married to really do that
Okay.
introspective work and then communicate that with their
Yeah.
significant other?
So wisdom is always about timing. So when is it wise to be able to have that conversation? One of the most helpful pieces of marriage advice was I was sitting outside of a classroom when a mentor friend of mine by the name of Dan Allender was speaking. And my parents, my dad had been a pastor for about 30 years and then saw, yes, the church can change people. Yes, the pulpit is powerful. But part of what he started reconciling was so much of the changes that he was seeing in people's lives really came through, counseling. And so my dad was trying to confront his own story, where he came from, and really heal and address things. So he came out to the same grad school that I was at. And then my girlfriend at the time, Heather, now my wife, was in a class with my dad called sexual disorders. So I was sitting outside the classroom waiting for my girlfriend to come out when I heard Dan say that the marital bedroom is the noisiest room in the entire house. Your porn history is there, your mother is there, your father is there, your ex-lovers are there, culture is there, media is there. So it is a very, very noisy room. And so I think part of what couples have to begin to grapple with is that sense of, we don't come into the relationship as a blank slate. We all have all these stories, all these pattern ways of thinking, making meaning out of things that have to be addressed. So for me, whenever I'm doing intensive work with either an individual or a couple, I'm always thinking through the realm of, scaffolding. So here in New York City, scaffolding is everywhere. And so the basic notion of scaffolding is, if I'm going to move very high up to address this very high level issue, which might be pornography, infidelity, sexual abuse, I better be sure to have some very, very solid scaffolding in place in the relationship and outside the relationship in order to move to some of those high level issues. So I'll pause the language of scaffolding and come back to it. The second issue would be what would be referred to as a window of tolerance, which is Dan Siegel's phrase. So you can Google it, but essentially there is a window of tolerance. So think of two parallel lines, and in the middle is what's called the green zone, or the window of tolerance. That's where the self is flexible, it's adaptive, your soul is energized. It's like, yes, I get to do this day. I let my wife sleep in. She's feeling fresh. She's in her window of tolerance. The red zone is that sense of fight or flight, just some level of stress, adrenaline, noradrenaline, catecholamines. And then the blue zone is, just paralysis, it's depression, it's the Monday morning blues. And so what often happens is people go way too high up in revelation and in disclosure without thinking about the issue of scaffolding or the issue of window of tolerance. So if you have a very narrow window of tolerance and you are reliant on someone else's validation to soothe you, if your partner struggles with porn or has a life outside of you that precedes you, your narrow window of tolerance is going to cause you to go into the red zone and potentially, just react in a very angry, cortisol driven manner, or go into something of the blue zone where you just go into full on paralysis of, I can't believe this is happening. So wisdom is about saying, okay, like, how do I increase my window of tolerance for distress?
Yeah.
And maybe there's information there around betrayal that needs to be grieved, that needs to be angry. Like, I'm not I'm not saying if you go into the red zone or blue zone, it's revealing your immaturity there. But I'm just saying you have to be thinking about,
Mm,
is the information that I'm about to get, am I going to go into the red zone with this or the blue
yeah.
zone?
Makes
Yeah.
But
sense.
also, what's the scaffolding? So to very quickly cover, another Dan Siegel concept that, a lot of people know, but I think it's really helpful. It's the 4 S's, which are seen, safe, soothed, secure. So I would say before you're going into sexual fantasy life, before you're going into sexual failure, before you're going into sexual fantasies or inhibitions, it's that sense of like each partner should know the 4 S's of
Mm,
their other partner.
mm,
Like, where were you seen? Where were you not seen?
mm,
What was a form of soothing for you? So, some people found soothing through pornography. Some people found soothing through getting a 1500 on their SAT and being very driven in their life. So all of us are navigating the world through seen, safe, soothe, secure. So what helps you feel secure
mm,
late in the evening? It could have been
mhm,
porn. It could have been grades. It could have been being a golden child. So
Yeah.
all of us have to
mm,
grapple with our 4 S's. So before I disclosed my sexual fantasy life and porn history to Heather, that was part of, she needed to know my family of origin. She
mm,
needed to know my relationship with my mom. She needed to know just the ways that food was, in many ways, the first escape hatch for me.
mm,
And she needed to know my self contempt. And part of what I would say is, we are driven towards unhealthy behaviors not because they provide a relief or an escape, but far more they create irrefutable evidence that our core belief about ourselves is true. So if
Mhm.
I think that I am overweight, unwanted, full of self-contempt, lo and behold, I pursue behaviors that reinforce that narrative against me. So I keep saying this notion of a long answer, but before you go into those very important, meaningful waters, each partner needs to really step into, okay, what's the scaffolding that we
yeah.
have in place? Community, friendship, other conversations, and then also, what's my maturity level at
Mhm.
with regard to my window of tolerance? And if you are increasing your window of tolerance and disclosing things that aren't just highly triggering and sexual in content, then I think your relationship is in a really good place to be able to continue to trust one another more and more with that process of disclosure, because it, the bedroom is a very noisy room.
Mm,
So true. Jay, that was phenomenal.
so good.
I might need to listen to that like 3 times back to really grab everything you said in there. So that's just, your brain is like on hyper speed. And I'm like, oh man, this is phenomenal stuff. Jay, I love what you're talking about because again, I think so many people, including us, we jump to those desires again, right? Being full of shame or can I tell somebody this? How much tolerance do we have in our relationship to uncover these things? But I think when we approach it with this curiosity piece, it's less of, okay, we have to make a decision afterward, and I can just simply create space to understand it, just to
Mm-hmm.
interview. You talked before, like interviewing your lust, right? And I think like that's what I hear you saying over and over again in different ways. And I think it's phenomenal because we can't say it, can't be overstated. And that is this like, what are those core beliefs? What's that narrative that we've been listening to? Because I do think that a lot of times we jump to it being an escape or a coping mechanism, a survival tactic. And instead, what you're saying is understand these core beliefs. For maybe a listener who's like, wow, this is great. This is a lot. I don't even know what that means. What are some examples of a core belief, or even if you want to bring one up from one of the examples you talk about in desire, but what would one of those core beliefs be? What's an example of
Yeah.
taking that a step further and looking past the coping mechanisms and the survival
Mm-hmm.
tactics into a core belief?
Yeah, like one client that I'm talking about in the context of desire, and again, changing the storylines, but like, let's say that there's this man struggling with premature ejaculation, and he gets into a marriage and just this sense of feeling like a failure all the time. So he can't hold on long enough. He has a past porn history. Is it porn induced erectile dysfunction? Is it something else? And so he just feels like a failure, and his sex life is something that he is compulsively drawn to, but every time he gets there, he feels like he's failing, whether he's doing it in secret or whether he's doing it kind of in the context of his marriage. And so part of just my clinical work with him was just like slowing it down to be able to say, like, tell me about your inner voice. And one of the things we often say in psychology is that the way that parents talk to their children becomes their inner voice. And that's really important, that a lot of times we think like my inner voice is something that I'm saying or evil is saying. And sure, it could be, but it could also be part of the way that your parents talk to you. Or it could also be revealing that your parents never talked to you and you formed very self-contemptuous language in the absence of receiving care. But for this particular client, the first thing that came up for him was he was an athlete. His dad was a college athlete, and he can remember just his dad being at, basketball games, baseball games, and his dad is just that classic person always yelling like box out, don't miss the free throw, like. And then in baseball, it would be like, protect the plate. There's 2 strikes. And so when he would do well after his games, his dad would be beaming for him, kind of just tap him on the chest. And then at other points where he would make errors, strike out, miss, the game winning shot or free throw, his dad would just desert him there. And
Mm.
so part of the story that he was replicating in his marriage was, this inner sense of berating myself all the time. Like, so instead of it being his dad's voice yelling at him, he was yelling at himself to be able to stay present to his wife, to be able to not fail, which for him meant essentially orgasming at the same time. So that would be a particular example. Or, I think I've talked about this in Desire as well, where, a woman came into my office just talking about how she had gone for a run and she was just like gloriously sweaty. I think it was like a June day. And just like it basically said, "How was your workout?" And she said, "It was great. I crushed it." And I'm a therapist who's paid to be hyper vigilant about word choices. And so like I knew what the phrase meant, but I was like, so like how many miles and how many minutes do you have to run in order to crush something? And for her, the equation was essentially running 8 miles in under an hour. And so I said, what if you only run like 5 miles or 4? What happens? And she's like, well, I'd probably feel more shame around my body. And
Mm.
again, she's naming something really good, but she's still at 15,000 feet. The human heart does not change until we begin to enter into the particularities. So she's not feeling shame about her body or her elbow. I know that shame is actually located somewhere in her face, in her body. And so I just said, like, I thank you for telling me that your body feels shame, but I also know like there's probably an area of particularity that you feel more shame than others.
Mm,
And part of what she stepped into was it was her thighs. And
mm,
again, the backstory with her thighs was that she was swimsuit shopping with her mom back in high school. And her mom looked at her bathing suit and essentially said, women in this side of the family have very thick thighs. You're really going to have to work on exercising. And so her desire to crush workouts had been traumatized
mm,
by a mom who had cursed her body. So that sense of, you know, so much of what she was pursuing
mm,
in life and this development of like a mastery response over her body was really informed by trauma. So all of us have you know voices, messages inside of us
mm,
that are authoring our life. And
mm,
so I think that's the invitation, is what authors
mm,
are authoring your life? Is it a
Wow.
mom? Is it a dad? Is it media? Is it idolatry? And so we have to have that, just really good interoception, really good sense of where, what's authoring these desires in my particular life today.
Yeah, I love that. What you said, something that I felt like was very staggering. It made me pause. And you talked about self mastery being maybe a
Mhm.
response to trauma. These are, when you said this, I was like, oh man, Jay's going to get some flack for this. And I was stoked. I was like, this is going to be awesome, because in a world where we celebrate success, we don't often realize how this could be a way that you are coping, or that you are running away from these different things. If she comes in, I mean, no one would say anything that you said. If a girl came in super sweaty from crushing a workout, we'd all be like high-fiving her, like, way to go, right? We're all at CrossFit. We're all counting our macros. We're all on these different ways of just
Self-care, you're
killing it.
doing
Yeah.
it.
You
Totally.
name it, right? And I guess what you're saying is also, hey, we might need to look deeper than that as well. Like, instead of just, because I think on the outside looking in, and I love those self-help books. They're phenomenal. I've read a lot of them. And they're great. They're really inspirational. But I remember my therapist asking me, well, Clint, one of my goals at that time was like getting a brand new truck. And he was like, okay, well, who are you if you get the truck? And I was like, oh, well, I'm killing it, crushing it, like you said, right? But then he was like, who are you if you don't? Who are you if you keep driving your Kia? You know what I mean? And there was so much underneath that. And I don't know if you want to say a word to that, but like, what does somebody need to hear, not to feel shame and defeat, but that would create this, oh, well, let me interview that one. Let me take a perspective shift on that. What would you tell somebody who is struggling with that, or feels like they're...
Yeah, so there's so much wisdom in the world, and that's the dilemma. Is like when I listen to like a Huberman podcast, and it's like, get 7 to 9 hours of sleep, expose yourself to sunlight in the morning, get this many amount of steps, do sauna, like all these things are very, very helpful. But I think you have to kind of be able to say, like, am I pursuing this as a type of trauma response? So whenever trauma is taking place, what happens is that the ground beneath you can't trust anymore. I can't trust my body. I can't trust God. I can't trust relationships. And then a sense of, trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And so you can't stay in a wound. You can't stay in the reality that your mom cares more about the cleanliness of the house than she does your own soul. You can't stay in the reality that your dad has deserted your family and is full of humiliation. So instead, it's just easier for you to say, my dad would tease me every once in a while, rather than really stepping into, no, he actually humiliated me. So that is wounds. Those are difficult. And when we are wounded, we need to be able to dissociate from that. We can't just stay in pain. And so then you begin to find some level of mastery, some level of, it could be a food addiction, could be dysmorphia driving you to the gym, but it could be, I was bullied as a kid, I was beat up. And so that would be the classic example. Someone's bullied because they're weak, they're small, they're scrawny, and then they develop this kind of small man complex. And then they need to be able to get muscles. They need to be able to, grow in that sense of kind of developing muscle, feeling strong is self-soothing to them in a really good way. But then they begin to over-index, and that becomes the solution for any time I feel small. So in many ways, they are neglecting and abdicating that sense of offering care and tears for a boy, for a girl that was humiliated. And now they're trying to find mastery over their body. So instead of it being a middle school bully or a mother or a father who is a bully, now they bully themselves into certain protocols so that they begin to feel strong and integrated in life.
Wow.
And so, he's deceased now, but John O'Donohue, great poet, once said, may you find in yourself a courageous hospitality for all that is broken or hurting inside of you. And I think that's really what we need more than anything, is first to be able to kind of say, there's things that are broken and hurting inside of me. And how do I desire to grow in my capacity to offer hospitality to what's hurting? Because if we're not doing that, then I think we're developing something of a mastery response over the vulnerabilities of our life. Wow. So, but our culture is full of, this is the way to mastery. This is the way to feel good, successful, integrated. And it's all providing that sense of solid ground underneath your feet in the aftermath of trauma.
I feel like that pendulum is either the self-mastery, control, prevention of being hurt again, or it's that victimhood mindset of like being stuck in it. And so when you say all that, I'm like, oh man, fantastic. Yes, we need to be able to understand it. And I keep saying the same words because I'm not as educated as you, but like interview it and get to a point where we get what's underneath it. But Jay, we work with a lot of betrayed spouses, right? Where they're able to get to this point where they actually understand, wow, there is trauma that's happened to me
Mhm.
because of my spouse doing these things. And I think what you're saying is, okay, who is that that's speaking that into you? Where is that the authorship, right? How are you authoring your life based off what you're being told? So how do we get to a point where we now I picture myself understanding these things and going, wow, yeah, I was humiliated. I was this, I was betrayed. There were these things that happened that created all these emotions. I've used these coping
Mhm.
mechanisms as it, but how do I not stay in that victimhood mindset? How do I
Mhm.
start to transform and create that like post-traumatic growth model where we're growing from those traumas?
Mhm. Yeah, the crucibles of our life are pushing us to grow. And so much of what happens when you enter into a marriage is that sometimes people think that their marriage is broken. And I think sometimes it is. But I think part of the role of marriage is to expose where both partners are underdeveloped in their capacity for love. And so sometimes what happens in the context of marriage is you begin to, I always think about like a good marriage is a little bit like a symphony that, when I go to the symphony in New York, I want to make sure that my violinist is Juilliard trained, the brass, the percussion team, like they have done the 10,000 hours of work required to get to the stage. So that when they come together, it's not just that they make melody, but there is beauty in the dissonance of the notes and in the ways that they come together. But oftentimes, what happens in marriage is we arrive at the stage of intimacy and then we blame the stage or we blame the partner rather than saying, like, no, we are all very underdeveloped in intimacy, and marriage is exposing that. So I'm going to nuance that as it relates to betrayal trauma. And one of the things that I often find in the context of betrayal trauma is that, let's just use the example of like a man who cheats on his wife. Sometimes I'll just use two examples that I was in this past week. One example would be a woman is cheated on, and the meaning that she makes is that I will never be good enough.
Mm,
Another meaning that another woman made this week was, you know, I can't trust him, but I had some intuition that something was off, but I suppressed it.
Yeah.
And so part of what that second woman was dealing with was not only the betrayal of her spouse, but a self abandonment, a self betrayal
mm,
of I knew something was up, but I didn't speak about that. And that's the nature of trauma is that we have, yes, the betrayal trauma, but then we also have another tributary, which might be self betrayal. And she's like, I'm so stupid. I should have known better. But again, that language of contempt doesn't help you get curious. And so, as we began to work through her story this past week, part of what we started recognizing is that she grew up in a religious system and in a family of origin system that was always getting her to suppress what she knew. It was always denying her
wow.
reality. It was always saying to her, you can't trust your heart. You can't trust your intuition, And so that became a very damaging way of, the language that I used is you went mind blind, that was
Mm,
kind of baptized as virtuous of just, I'm not going to see what I see. I'm not going to know what I know. And so part of the invitation of this season of just heartache, and again, like full of weeping, mourning, like not trying to romanticize any of this, but that sense of like, this is actually an opportunity for both of them to step into like, where did we come from? And for her, it's that sense of what would it mean for her to honor that something is right? And when she begins to honor what was right, very quickly, she had a lot of stories of her mom and her dad denying reality.
mm,
So, of course, in many ways, she married a partner who reinforced something that was very familiar and
yeah,
familial to her. And that became the meaning of the work was we're not just going to try and control and regulate your husband's behavior and do polygraphs and make sure that he's okay, we're also going to kind of address some of the places in
yeah.
you that you abandon yourself. So that was the second woman. The first woman, just stepping into, she has hated her life. She the meaning that she made out of her husband's infidelity was that he found someone at work that he felt was smarter than her.
Mm.
And so again, that was the meaning, wasn't so much that she was more beautiful, it's that this woman who's working, which is where a lot of infidelity begins. Like, she had the smarts, she went to a really good university, and of course he was drawn to her. So the meaning she was making wasn't neutral, it wasn't random. And so that became
Yeah.
part of the work that she also needed to do. So um these are complicated waters, and that's where it's just easier to kind of have that external locus of control of, I'm bad, I'm immoral, or my partner is just, they brought in so much misery into my life, because psychologically it's cleaner if it's just that simple. But like,
Yeah.
these are so many tributaries in the water when you're coming into infidelity, when you're coming into betrayal trauma.
Yeah.
So kindness, curiosity, wisdom around you. We need a lot of wisdom and a lot of kindness and a lot of strength as we begin to engage this stuff.
The other thing I think that we need, Jay, is the right voices. And I'm so grateful that you are one of those in this space. And I really say that just with like so much conviction in my heart, because the work that you're doing is helping people like me, right, who have betrayed my spouse, who created all this brokenness in our marriage, show up with those ways. And so I can't thank you enough as we wrap up today's episode, because I hope everybody buys your books. They don't just buy Desire. They buy Unwanted. They read these through, and they get to a point where they can start understanding, wow, like there is profound healing and profound realization at what, if I interview that brokenness, if I take time to understand what was underneath it. And I'm just so grateful for the work that you're doing. Because I just think that that's what changes a heart. And I think, just to tie it back into Jesus, because I know we all go there, love going there. You come back to that author, and this isn't about just like reading scripture and putting a band-aid on. This isn't about like, oh, let me just quote this verse enough to find healing. No, I think this is that Jesus wants to enter into the recesses of our heart and show us those moments that started to form us. And he wants to form us into his likeness, not because it's going to be transactional, but it's moment by moment. I think that Jesus transformed me more in those moments of me just crying out full of tears, or it's anger and they're swearing, and they're just like these moments of raw, and like, where were you here? And why did you allow this? And Jesus, can you see how much this formed me? And what the heck, And it's like experiencing that with the Holy Spirit, and Jesus going, yeah, that wasn't the way it was supposed to be. It did form you this way, but man, here's how I can transform you into this, and more and more. And I have a lot of work to still do, but I do believe that the work that you've done, Jay, has helped me on my journey. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, just to clarify, like, the reason why we do this family of origin work, the reason why we look to the past is not to like make excuses, but like, honesty is a muscle that develops the more that we use it. So if I can't be honest with my mom and my dad, I'm not going to be honest with myself. If I don't have tears of grief for the betrayals that I have suffered in very formative stages, I already know that a partner isn't going to step into his or her betrayal trauma of their spouse. So all of this is that work of changing the human heart to be able to make it more tender, less calcified, so that I can be more honest with myself, so I can be more tender, more empathetic with regard to what has happened. And the reason why we do all of this is, self-sabotage and betrayal inhibit desire. So I think of this will be kind of closing thought of just, the master has given us talents. You could say desires. And many of us are suppressing those desires. Many of us are not spending those things well, but the master's harshest words are to those that suppress the talents. And so I think, when it comes to doing this work, whether it's this podcast, whether it's a book that you write, I write, whether it's something that your team creates, it's like, all of that is because of desire. Like
Mm.
your all's ministry, your all's books don't exist without desire, without stepping into this. And I think that's what I really want to wake people up to is, a lot of times desire gets a bad rap because it does occasionally move into selfishness. But I promise you, every good meal you've ever had, every good podcast you've listened to, every good workbook you've gone through is because someone was foolish enough to start desiring to create it. And then for 2 or 3 years of misery and editing and iterations, they had to keep creating it. Not that you all don't know anything about that, but just
Not at
that
all.
sense of like desire, well formed,
Mm.
creates massive changes in the lineage and the inheritance that our children have. So it takes seriously the desires that the God of the universe has put inside you.
Love that so much. It's such a different perspective shift and also such a needed perspective shift. And it's one that's biblical, in my opinion. And it allows us
Mhm.
to really flourish into the children of God that He's designed us to be, right? It's we are to bear fruit, we are to look different. And how that happens is through all of this, right? And so I'm just so thankful for you, Jay. Thank you so much for your book. And I just hope that every one of our listeners just goes to all the resources that you are pouring out. And we're just so
Please check those
thankful.
out in the show notes. They'll all be
Yes.
right down there below. So, Jay, thanks again for being with us today. It has
Yeah,
been an
so
honor
good to
and a
be with
privilege.
you all. So thank you for the privilege of being on your show. Enjoyed our conversation.